Morning, everybody. Welcome to Second Cup of Coffee. Pastor Tom here with you. This is week 4 of our series, Honor the Fallen. Honor the Fallen. Typically, we do a conversation. And this month, we're going to do a little bit different. I'm going to give you the conversation that happened in my head as a young man. Never wanted to be a pastor. My dad was a pastor through a series of events. He was no longer a pastor, and kind of walked away from God for a season, came back to God. And very honored to have the dad I have. Love him very much. He's gone on to be with the Lord. But when I was growing up, because of the events that happened as a kid, I didn't want to be a pastor. And in my mind, I said, I don't want to be put in that place that he was. And I don't think that was a wrong recognition of the situation, but it was a wrong application of my obedience because God was calling me to pastor. And I had to walk through what I've been talking to you about. How do you honor the good and not focus on the bad? See, the reason I focused on the bad was because it was my get out of jail free card. I didn't have to do what God wanted me to do because I saw somebody else fail at it. Can I tell you unequivocally, that doesn't work before God. And you want to get that right on this side because I don't want to have that conversation on the other side. And even when I would make deals with God, he would hijack my deals because I told him, I said, if my dad ever goes back to church, God, I'll go back to church. Well, I was a junior in college and my dad called me one day, could tell you where I was sitting, tell you, I mean, it's seared in my mind because he called me, he said, I just called you to tell you I'm going back to church. Dead silence on the phone from me. To the point he's like, did you hear me? And I'm like, yeah, I heard you. And I'm a little irritated. Why? Because I made a deal with God. If he goes back to church, I'll go back to church. Well, I didn't go back to church. Why? Because I didn't want to go back to church. It had nothing to do with my dad being a success or a failure at being a pastor. It had everything to do with my rebellion and my sin. And so I had to walk through that. So sometimes, as we talked about in the past weeks, we keep people on the wall, and we don't want to take them down off the wall. We don't want to bury the bones of their sin because we want to use that as an excuse not to do what God's asked us to do. So what do we do to combat that? Well, it says at the end of 1 Samuel 31 that they took the bones and buried them, we talked about last week, under the tamarisk tree at Jabesh, and fasted 7 days. Why do you fast? They're fasting for mourning, for remembrance, those things. Why do you fast? For a reset. Why are you fasting for the reset? Because you need to begin to see things clearly, not just see the storm, but see the provision. You need to see it. I'll give you another biblical example. You can flesh this out for yourself. Paul's on the ship. They're going to be shipwrecked. Even though he said, don't go this way, they're going to be shipwrecked. What did they do? They fasted in the midst of that. Why? Because I think there is a symbolism there for us that in the midst of the shipwreck, in the midst of the storm, in the midst of something that hasn't cleared yet, and all of the emotion, I need to reset to God and what he's saying to me, and what he's saying to the situation. And maybe not the full situation, but how do I respond in the situation? Because I have to tell you, your healing and your coming out the other side is going to be a meandering path of grace. It's probably not going to be A to B. And there's usually two different things that people do with the meander, or when a failure happens. They either go super grace or super judgment. Super grace because, man, we all sin, brother, and super judgment because off with their head. Either way, why do we go that way? Because we just want it done, and they're simpler, they're cleaner, and they just get it done. Super grace, forgive them, let's move on. Super judgment, let's off with their head, let's move on. But the meandering path of grace has everybody's best intentions or best plans in mind, and so it meanders, and it's slower. And it's curves, and it goes up, and it comes back, and there's hills, and there's valleys, and all those things. Why? Because it's not the path I'm walking on, but the one I'm walking with. And my relationship with him is what is at stake. If you don't want to do what God is asking you to do, and you are using the failure of somebody else as an excuse, take it from somebody who did that for years and years and years and years and years. It is not worth that journey. Take the meandering path to grace with him. Walk with him, get to know him. As you get to know him, you'll begin to love him. As you love him, you'll trust him. As you trust him, you'll be obedient to him. And in that obedience, you're going to find a fulfillment in life and purpose that you wouldn't find any other way. I know it's a little bit different. We don't have another voice. It's not a conversation. But these are the conversations that I had to walk through in my own head to get to the place of purpose in my own life. I'm telling you, it's worth the journey. But you got to stay on the meandering path of grace, because that's the only way to get to your destination. If this meant something to you, please share it. Thank you for hanging out with us. You can find us on Facebook. You can find us on YouTube, either at Rancho Christian Center or our Second Cup of Coffee, or you can find us on our app. And we'll talk to you soon.